Okay, I think we're back in action. So welcome. Good morning. Happy Friday. All right, so today we're going to be sharing and talking about the seller payment concession for buyer broker compensation, better known as the SPBB form. All right. Does everyone know what that form is and what the purpose to utilize that form? Okay. I know we've been getting a lot of questions regarding it, so I'm going to go into a deep dive conversation regarding the SPBB form and how to navigate. Most of the information that I gather is straight from the California Association of Realtors. And it's basically a Q&A. It's questions and answers, okay? Because there's a lot of questions of when do we submit it? Is it before? Is it after? Do we need to have signature? What if there's no agreement? Or what if the compensation is different from what the seller is willing to compensate or what the buyer is willing to pay their buyer agent commission, right? So we're going to go into the presentation. And again, any and all questions, put them on the chat or raise your hand if you have any questions as well as we go. Hopefully, I'll be done in less than 45 minutes, but there's a lot of good information on the SPBB form. All right, so let's go ahead and start. All right, so how should a buyer request seller to pay the buyer broker commission, right? How do we request it, right? Well, it's one component is when you're in a conversation with a buyer, right? You're going through the buyer consultation, right? Part of the new process and how we navigate concessions, right? Because one, the MLS no longer has commission, right? In the past, we were so accustomed to see commission on the very bottom. Well, with all of the changes with NAR, that has been completely eliminated, right? Now it's a negotiation a process, right? One, you have to have some type of written agreement with the buyer. In the past, it was kind of loose, meaning a lot of buyers and agents would not sign agreements. One, the agent felt that it was a little bit too intimidating, that the buyers would be standoffish to sign the buyer representation agreement. And then there were some agents that were very proactive, and all of their conversations around working with the buyer was part of the process. If you want to utilize my services and work with me, we need to sign an agreement in place, right? And that's where the buyer representation agreement. Now, the BRBC form technically is not a new form. It's been in existence for quite some time, and it's just not a standard practice. Now, think about it for a minute, folks, okay? And what I mean by that is this. Would you go on a listing appointment, right? Provide what you're going to do to help the seller sell their home, right? And walk away without a written agreement? You probably wouldn't, right? No. So why is it that when you're working with a buyer, right? And I'm talking prior to NAR, why would you work with a buyer and not have something in writing? And guess what? A lot of buyer agents did that with the hope that what we have is the mutual understanding is that I'm going to work for you, you're going to work for me, we're going to find and identify a property, we're going to negotiate, open escrow, go through the due diligence process, and finalize whatever we need to do regarding inspections, appraisal, seller disclosures, uh, back and forth with the lender, title, making sure everything is fine, close the deal, and congratulations, here's the keys to your beautiful home, right? But then there's been circumstances and situations where the buyer goes somewhere else. You have worked diligently with this buyer for a couple weeks or a couple months, right? And now you find out that the buyer went in a different direction. And it's like, what happened here? But you didn't have a buyer representation agreement in place. And now you're reaching out to the broker saying, hey, what are my recourses here when a buyer went in a different direction? Am I entitled to compensation or a commission? And the answer I would always say is, did you have a buyer representation agreement, right? Some would say yes, some would say no. If you said no, unfortunately, you don't really have two legs to stand, okay? Because the way the process works of procuring costs, right? is if we were to escalate this to an arbitration, the arbitrator, in hearing our case, is going to look at it from the scale of weight, like the justice system, right? They're going to see what evidence, what proof you have compared to this buyer and this new agent involved, right? And if you don't have a buyer representation agreement, but this new buyer agent does, they have an agency agreement signed by the buyer, all of the advisory signed by the buyer, a purchase agreement executed by the buyer, open escrow with that buyer, then the scale of that weight is going to be heavy on this other agent that they're the procuring cost. But wait a minute, Simon, I worked with this buyer for a couple months. I understand that. But there's a reason why this buyer is no longer working with you. So I want to make sure that we're all in alignment when it comes to it. Okay, that's one. Okay, that's not today's topic. Today's topic is really diving into the understanding and how commissions or concessions work. Okay, so again, a lot of the information is going to be Q&A, and then we'll open it up to discussions. And then if we have some time, we'll also go into the actual form and also the purchase agreement under G3 that says when you check that, that section of the purchase agreement, it automatically populates the SPBB form, okay? Okay, so how should a buyer request a seller to pay the buyer commission, right? So it says that the buyer may request this as a seller credit or concession through the offer to purchase. Credit is generally can be requested by checking box 3G1 and writing a dollar amount, but to specifically request a credit to cover the buyer's obligation, because it is the buyer's obligation to pay you if you're representing the buyer, okay? To pay their own broker, a buyer should attach the SBPP to the RPA, the purchase agreement, by checking 3G3. Lenders have indicated that this type of credit will not be counted towards lender's limit on credits, okay? And we'll distinguish one from the other because there's concessions and there's broker fee, right? Concessions that the buyer is obligated to pay. What are some of the concessions that the buyer, excuse me, what are some of the fees that the buyer has to pay? Closing costs, right? Right? A down payment, right? Those are some of the things that the buyer's obligated. But also now with this new change is commissions, concessions. The buyer is responsible. Now, I want to set the tone and I want to be very, very clear. It's always been the buyer's responsibility to pay. But if you understand what the buyer representation agreement says, there's language in there that says that if anyone other than the buyer pays concessions to the buyer's agent, then that credits the buyer's obligation to pay them their fee, okay? And that's where this form comes into play. This is where 3G3 comes into play, okay? Okay, why isn't this going? All right. Is the seller bound to agree to pay the requested compensation? So if I'm a buyer's agent, right, and I'm working with Steve, right, and Steve is the listing agent as an example, right, is Steve and his client obligated to pay any commission to me? None, not under the new rules, okay? Remember, past NAR and present ANR are totally different now. Back then, we just had to go down to the MLS and see, right? We didn't have to negotiate it because it was already stamped and sealed on the MLS, right? 2.5%, fantastic. 3%, even better. Now it's not on there, you know, so now we have to incorporate as part of our process, meaning no difference than when you submit an offer, right? What are some of the indicators and paperwork that you're providing the listing agent, right? You want to look at the agent remarks, right, and see what they're requesting, because some are very specific of what they want. And if you don't provide those specifics, they already get a bad taste in the mouth. You know, do they really want to work with you? And some agents are that way. If they're asking for a pre-approval letter, proof of funds, okay, or if they want you to cross-qualify with their preferred lender and you're not going through the motion, they're gonna demonstrate that with the seller and says, look, there's specific demands that I'm requesting, and this agent is not complying to it. You know, that may steer in a way the seller from, you know, wanting to work. And I'm just being honest, okay? Not saying that the agent has any rights to say no to it because it's not our job. It's the seller's decision based on price, terms, and conditions, right? When an offer gets submitted, we must provide all of the offers to the seller. Okay. So in this example, is the seller bound to agree to pay the requested compensation? The answer is no. As with any term in the offer to purchase, it may be agreed to or countered out completely or as part of. Meaning, I can submit a request. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I can submit a request, right? Because remember, even price, terms, and conditions can be countered, right? Three things can the seller do, right? The seller can accept, the seller can counter, or the seller can reject. Yes or yes, right? Yeah. So now when you're requesting compensation, right, the seller can accept, the seller can counter, or the seller can reject it. Yeah. So those are the three options that the seller has. Meaning that if they accept what you're offering, congratulations, right? If you're offering or you're asking for 3% commission or concessions, right? They can come back and negotiate, says, I'm not going to give you 3%, but I'll give you 2% or 2.5%, right? Now you have to be in agreement. Are you okay with that? Because it's all about counter, right? You can say, no, I'm not okay with 2.5%. Correct. Correct. Yeah, because remember, you have to align what the buyer representation agreement says, right? Because what you put on the buyer representation, the BRBC, is what the buyer is responsible to pay you commission. Okay. So in essence, the way you look at it is make sure you understand what that amount is, what your fee is to represent a buyer. Okay. The higher, the better, because you can always negotiate that. Because if it's the reverse, now you either have to modify because you cannot take the higher amount if the seller is giving you X amount of commission. I hope that makes sense. Okay. And I'll explain in a little bit more. Question.
Let's say he counted for 2. So my friend, if he agrees to pay the difference, which is 1%, I'll go with that, right? Nothing to change in the contracts.
If you put 1% on the buyer representation agreement,
Condition is 3. He rejected the seller. He counted 2. So my buyer is going to pay 1%.
yeah.
Why? Or automatically.
Here it is. That's a very good question. The question here is, if you have 3% on the buyer representation agreement, right? And you submit the SPB form requesting 3%, right? The listing agent comes back and says, we're not going to do 3%, but we're only willing to do 2%, right? In essence, you can get commission from both parties. The seller would have the 2% that they will pay you. The buyer's still on the hook to pay you that 1%. So in essence, yes, you can get a total of 3% from the seller and from the buyer. Now, hold that thought. Let's say it's the reverse. Okay. You have 2% on the BRBC form. And you submit that request. Okay. No, I take it back. Let's say that the seller, let's say that you have 2% on the BRBC form, right? But the seller is offering 2.5%, right? You cannot get the higher amount. You have to either modify your buyer representation agreement, okay? in order to match what the seller is willing to pay. Otherwise, if you don't, then you're telling the seller we're willing to take the 2% instead of the 2.5%, because that's what the buyer is obligated to pay you. Okay, but you can modify that as well. Does that make sense?
I think what you're looking for, I think the answer to your question is if you end up having a BRBC at 3%, the seller comes back saying, I'm only going to give 2, which is that up to the buyer. Okay, the buyer now is going to sign the counter offer. He signs the counter offer. That all gets submitted to escrow. So there's no additional documentation.
When he submits, it's like,
now, when the buyer now signs that counter, the seller saying, I accept the 2%. Yeah, I have a BRBC here at 3%. The translation is what you really should clarify that they actually have clarification. They are responsible for that additional 1% closing cost that's going to get paid to you. And so there's no additional form that so you don't have to revise the original. You don't know. You don't have to revise the original. Then when all that paperwork gets sent up to escrow will be looking for it. What does the BRDC say? What does the counter offers of anything say? This is the seller's obligation that they're obligating. This is the buyer's obligation. They'll credit. And the difference is the buyer's requirement.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't want to, you always want to go with the highest amount, right? But you got to show your value when it comes to presenting it to the buyer, right? Because if you put 3% in the mind of the buyers, I'm obligated to pay that 3%. Now, the beauty of that is you don't have to, okay? As I stated, like you put 3%, the seller's paying 2%, the buyer's responsible to pay 1%, but you also have the ability to say, look, I'm okay just collecting the 2%. I don't need that extra 1% from the buyer. Okay, that's your option. In case, no. The buyer it already agreed to when they signed the buyer representation agreement to 3%. Okay. I understand that. I understand that. I'm just saying it's an option. Exactly. Well, I mean, but you have recourse because the buyer has already agreed to the 3%. Okay. So they already agreed to it. So you, as an agent, have the ability to collect commissions from both parties, the seller and the buyer, if you have the higher commission. Question. And then I'll answer the ones on Zoom as well.
No commission on the assignment, because maybe the seller's gonna go higher commission if you put 1%. You already lose because
you need a
2.5. That's what I'm saying.
You always need to put something on the buyer representation, and I'll explain it. If you have a savvy listing agent like a Steve Gottlieb, right? I'm going to use him. He's the listing agent, right? He may ask for a copy of your BRBC form, and if you have 0, then you're telling the seller, hey, he's working with 0 compensation. Then I don't have to offer anything, or offer 1%. But if you put 2.5 or 3%, right? Then there's an avenue that the buyer is responsible to pay, but we're also asking, right? We're asking the seller to help with the cost as well to pay the buyer's commission. Yes.
אתה צריך להגיד
Most of them that I've seen have been 2.5.
The standard, it's very far and few, but you may have someone that is desperately wanting to sell the property. It's been on the market. They're doing some incentives, and they want to get this property out, and they're willing to raise that 2 to 3%. It happens. It's not that often, but you'll see sometimes sellers. You'll see sellers also, in the past, and I'm saying in the past, offer 4 to 5%.
So
Yeah.
let's say the good level market below 10. You have a fight, you're going to buy it, I'm going to be beneficial of 3%, just to shoot high.
I always want to shoot high. Yeah. I was coaching one of our agents here in the office, and she was able to get a buyer representation agreement at 3%. She found and identified a property that the buyer was interested. She submitted her SPBB form with the offer, and they came back saying, "Look, we can't do 3%, but we can do 2.5%." Okay, so the agent was, yeah, that's what ultimately what I wanted is to be right in between the 2.5, or 3%. She shot for the high 3%, right? The seller came back and accepted with a condition of 2.5%. The buyer agent was happy with 2.5, and is going to offset the buyer for paying that 0.5%. That's what I was saying. You can, or you can say, no, the buyer still is responsible to pay. And then the buyer would have to come in with the additional funds to escrow to make this work. Closing cost, down payment, plus additional compensation to pay you your commission. Okay. All right. Good questions, guys. Well, let's continue. Rosie had a question yesterday during Renat's legal Zoom training in our office. She was advising not having an agreement with the seller when having the listing agreement where the seller agrees to pay commission to the buyer's agent in writing for a possible potential liability. I know that KW created a form for this. Please advise. Okay. So yes, we do not, because if you look at the listing agreement, there's nothing on the listing agreement that says about cooperating compensation agreement. There's nothing. It only has two sections: your commission and a commission of representation for an unrepresented buyer, meaning someone that is not being represented. Those are the two. This doesn't say anything about compensation to a buyer's agent. With that being said, remember, prior to new NAR, right? Prior, we had the MLS. Prior, we had a listing agreement, right? A listing agreement that had total commission cooperating 5%, 2.5 to the listing side, 2.5 to the buyer side, right? Then the change of August 13 and August 17 came into play, right? Last month. Now we incorporated a lot of the past language to the new standard of doing business, right? Now that was eliminated, but there was a modification done regarding all of this change in full transparency, full disclosure, right? And that disclosure is telling the seller, hey, under this new rule is the MLS is eliminated compensation. Now you have the option, okay, to pay or not to pay. Okay. And some seller says, look, I'm okay. Let's just leave it the way it is. And a lot of our agents at prior listings incorporate that. We just needed to have it in writing. All right. That the seller is okay. It's the seller's discretion. The seller can do whatever they want, right? Because they're the ones that ultimately are paying concessions, right? No difference than if a buyer requests as part of their request of repairs, right? They may ask for $5,000, $10,000. The seller has the option, right, to pay for requests for repairs. Well, in this instance, if the sellers are giving us direct question or statements saying that they're okay to continue, then we just need to have it in writing, right? And that's where we created a form to help offset those questions, because there were still sellers that wanted to sell and still pay a buyer's agent because they want all eyes on their property, right? So they were okay. So that's where that form came into be. And I understand in Rosie's question in regards, of course, we're not going to have a conversation around the past standard way of doing business, right? We're not. When you go on a listing and a seller says, what's the commission? The commission is only your commission, not anything else. But the question can be is, what if the buyer asks about the other agent who submits an offer? That's a very good question, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. they have to now submit a request. And your position is three things. Yes to the accepting of a concession to the buyer's agent, no to it, or we can negotiate that. But that's going to be part of whatever offers come in. Because if you get 4 offers that come in with 4 different terms, and 2 of those are offering good price, but they're also asking commission or concessions, and the other 2 are not, you got to weigh it out because at the end, it's based on your seller's net proceeds, right? Because if you think about it, commissions is part of the seller's net proceeds. Okay. The more they pay out on things, the less of their net proceeds, right? And commission is one of the biggest fees that that in the past would have to pay, right? So we have to look at all those barriers. So going back to Rosie's question is, we provided this form as an option. The seller doesn't have to, but it's an option. We can provide it. Here's the options to, if you're interested in paying, then here's the form. If you're not, then we leave it open, okay? And now the buyer would have to, and the buyer agent would have to come in and submit the request. And now we present it to the seller. Seller, here is the offer that they brought, but they're also asking for 2.5%. How would you like to proceed? And now you're going to create your counteroffer. Price shall be, escrow to be, title to be, delete section so, commission or concessions will be, X amount, okay, if any. All right, the next question is, I will be better to include the higher commission. Yeah, absolutely. Always go for the highest one. All right, cannot hear those comments. Sorry about that. We cannot hear the side comments. Okay. So if you have any questions, guys, just make sure to raise your voice, please. Who's talking in the room? It's confusing because we cannot hear. All right. Yeah.
Not the 3G3, the 3G1 that says that the seller has to give a certain percentage.
Yeah, remember there's a section that says about percentage and flat fee. Correct. Correct.
Mine's only when it's raised with this SPB, that's it.
That is correct. Yeah. All right. The next one is, how would a seller counter the buyer request to pay their broker compensation? There are several ways. First, the seller can counter to increase the price by the amount requested on the SPBB, which may be useful if the buyer has limited out-of-pocket funds for the down payment and closing costs. But if the seller were to counter the compensation directly, one possible way is to write it into the seller counteroffer under paragraph 1A. The SPBB is modified to, and this is the language that you can use, seller agrees to pay a percentage of the purchase price or a flat fee towards the buyer's obligation to pay the buyer broker. Okay, I want to emphasize and I want to stress that it's the buyer's responsibility to pay you, right? If you're the agent representing the buyer. It's not the old traditional way. It's not agent to agent commission anymore. Okay, this is why it's important that you have a buyer representation agreement in place. If the SPBB is countered, should the seller still sign the form? Okay. Yes. It is an attachment to the purchase agreement, and it is a provision should be included in the purchase agreement, even if it's stated an amount of the compensation is being countered, right? Remember, it's no difference than you submit an offer, the seller comes back with the seller counter offer, and you're not happy with the seller counter offer. Now the buyer sends a buyer counter offer, right? You still have to sign all of the forms, okay? Because it's based, if you look at the purchase agreement under definition, it talks about acceptance, okay? And acceptance goes, and I don't know all the language of acceptance, but it talks about, maybe Steve, you can chime in this. An acceptance is after an execution of the purchase agreement, any counter offers, right? that's when it's considered an acceptance. Well, the same thing now when we incorporate the compensation, the SPB form, that is part of the agreement, right? Because if we don't have that signed, there's no agreement. Maybe the other stuff are in agreement, but your compensation may not be. So you want to make sure that the buyer signs, and there's a section, I believe, that the seller signs as well, accepting those terms.
I mean, like the form, like an argument could be, well, I don't want to sign this form. If it says 3%, I'm only offering 2%. You know, when you're making reference to the 2% in your counter offer, no different than when you sign the RPA, also issuing that counter offer. It's an acknowledgement of the form as part of the RPA package. Okay. That's all it is. You know, it doesn't mean you're accepting the 3%. It just means that you've acknowledged the form, the paperwork, you've acknowledged the SPBV. There is now a counter offer, you know, reference to it. Okay. No different if it's just initial level.
That's right. All right, let's continue. All right, can the buyer request more compensation in the SPB than what the buyer has in fact agreed to pay their own broker? Okay, I'm going to repeat the question. Can the buyer request more compensation in the SPB than what the buyer has in fact agreed to pay their own broker? The answer is no. The SPB states that the amount requested is no more than the amount that the buyer is obligated to pay their own broker pursuant to a buyer representation agreement. This limitation is based directly on the terms of the NAR settlement. All right. Are we clear on that? Any questions? Yes, John.
That be an option, they had no offers.
No, not at all.
It would be an option to the seller.
It wouldn't.
He would say he could so request more than what's their buyer representation agreement.
You can modify the buyer representation agreement, and I want to be very clear on that, right? You can modify it to adapt to what the seller is willing to pay. But you have to do a modification of it prior to do so, because remember, if you have a savvy listing agent asking for a copy of your BRBC, and it's not the entire, and I think there's a question regarding, do we need to provide the entire BRBC? The answer is no. Okay, only the last page of the buyer representation agreement. There's a section there where it says the total compensation that the buyer is responsible to pay you commission. Okay. All right, so let me answer a couple of questions here on Zoom. All right, so if the seller counters at a higher price to add the buyer commission, then there can be an appraisal issue. 100%. Yeah, that's the gamble. So if you are asking the buyer, right, this is where you got to be savvy, right? Reduce the contingencies, right, an appraisal, or ask the buyer to release appraisal contingency. Remember, you got to look at at all of the elements, right? Proof of funds, right? Do they have enough money to close this deal? If they're putting a 20%, right, and you see that they only have 20%, that's questionable, right? Because there's still closing fees. There's additional unexpected fees that may incorporate to this, right? So you got to understand is where's the additional means to do so? And now more so, guys, the standard practice is if the buyer is responsible to pay commission, do they have enough means to pay a closing fees, down payment, and 2.5 or 3% compensation if the seller says no to paying the buyer's agent commissions. Okay. So now you got to incorporate all of those elements, right? And more so as a buyer's agent consulting, right? Consulting your buyers, part of the process now is having that hard conversation is, hey, do you have the means to, to put a down payment? Yeah. Okay. What does that look like? Are we putting 5%, 3.5%, 10%, 20%? Okay. Closing costs are incorporated, but also, do you have the means to pay commission. And you can have that conversation because the buyer is responsible. And part of the conversation you can have with the lender too is to incorporate all of those fees. So when the buyer gets an estimated, what is it called? An estimated, what do you call it? A breakdown of all your fees, right? They should be adding also that, that percentage, whatever it is. If it's 3%, 2.5%, say again.
Percentage that we must discuss with the customer. That we should tell them that we should take into consideration 5%, 8% close.
Well,
No.
do you want to?
It used to be out prior to the settlement of the day. On average, I used to tell my clients it'd be about 2%, 1.5% to 2% of your purchase price, would be your out of pocket. So just I'll put that into
Right.
in a general format, a general dialogue. Okay. At that point, we cannot get seller as a concession. My fee is 3%, and so that was for the 5% on top of your down payment. Do you have it? You have the means, and you also have the willingness to pay.
That's right.
Those are the two questions.
Because my goal is obviously to try to negotiate it from the seller, but if the seller comes back with nothing, then I have to ask, can you pay me compensation? Otherwise, then, we need to have an alternative option here. Yeah, exactly. But that's a good question on the appraisal, because what
Option then saying that we have to go with the alternative, what
well, the alternative would be is if the seller's not willing to pay and you cannot afford to pay me compensation, then I have to make an executive decision if I have to step out of this, because I cannot tell the buyer they have to pull out of this transaction. They can buy the property, but then they're not going to be represented by me because I'm not going to be involved in the transaction without getting paid. So then I would have to step out, unfortunately, from this agreement. And now the buyer has to make a decision if they want to work directly with the listing agent, unfortunately, as an unrepresented client. Or the buyer may say, look, I just don't feel comfortable. I'd rather, within my contingency period, decide to maybe cancel and let's go find another property that they're willing. Or maybe you can just shoot for the start one more time and see if the listing agent is willing. Heck, this is where negotiations come into place, guys. This is where you need to really sharpen your pencil to understand is, look, just because they say no the first time doesn't mean that you cannot ask it in a different direction, right? And says, look, yeah, guys, the buyers are giving you a good offer, work with us. One is raise the price, right, as indicated here on the presentation, but understand that there may be a gap too with the appraisal, right? What if the appraisal comes back and it's less than what you offer? Now you're kind of back to square one. So you've got to look at the bigger picture as well. Okay, good questions, guys. All right, could we request listing agreement as they do to the BRBC to see if the seller is providing a commission? The answer is not necessarily, because remember, the listing agreement doesn't have anything about buyer agent commission. So it's useless to have a listing agreement because it's only going to show what the listing agent is charging their client, the seller. It doesn't have anything about commissions to the buyer. So even if you ask, it offsets, what you're trying to accomplish. Because the only thing it's going to say is going to say the commission for the seller, for the listing agent, and then maybe possibly an unrepresented client. So it's not going to have any specific language on there, and I believe they don't even have to provide that as part of the process. Only on the other, because the buyer is requesting the seller to pay us compensation as part of the initial process for transparency. Then yes, the listing agent can ask for a copy of that buyer representation agreement, right? So. All right, let's continue. We cannot hear the side comments. Okay. I completely understand. I don't have a mic here, folks, so I'll do my very best to ask the question and repeat the question. All right, can the buyer agent write a provision into their buyer representation agreement in which they will agree to reduce the charge commission to whatever the amount the seller agrees to pay? I want to repeat it one more time. Can the buyer agent write a provision in their buyer representation agreement in which they will agree to reduce the charge commission to whatever amount the seller agrees to pay? So basically, if you put on the buyer representation agreement that you're charging 3%, and in other terms, right, can you put this provision that says, look, whatever the seller gives me, I'm willing to take, but we're going to put it in writing, okay, is what this question is, right? So if the buyer, excuse me, if the listing agent, excuse me, if the seller gives me 1%, that's what I'll agree to. So the question to all of you is, can you do that on the buyer representation agreement? Okay, let's find out. The answer is no. This type of provision would violate the terms of the NAR settlement. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
In most cases, listing agent asks the seller paying.
So yeah, you can ask the listing agent, hey, is the seller providing concessions, right? You cannot say commissions. It can be concessions, right? Yes or no. The listing agent, if authorized, can say, yes, seller is considering concessions. Please submit your request. Okay.
So there wouldn't be really change it if you ask him.
That's correct. Okay. So I guess the question here, and I know a lot of people are questioning, like, wait a minute, if we put something in the buyer representation agreement that we are okay getting anything that the seller provides, why can't we put that on the agreement? What if that's the lingo, right? And you put that and the buyer signs that, right? And now the seller gets a copy of it, right? And the seller says, I'll give you $1. You agree to it. You agree to it, right? Whatever the seller gives you, I'm okay with it. I'll give you $1. And I'm being funny, folks. Okay, so please, I'm just. Yeah. So, but that violates the NAR rules, unfortunately. So, you cannot put any type of language that says that. You put what you want as compensation, right? 3%, 2.5%, 2.75, 2.225, whatever that is. That's what is set in total. The beauty is you can modify that, right? Because if the seller is willing to pay more or less, then you modify it. If it's less, then you're okay. Now you have the option to collect the additional means from the buyer. But if it's more, then you have to modify because the seller cannot give you more than what you already have on your buyer representation agreement.
You modify it, that means you count it.
No, you modify your buyer representation agreement to whatever the seller is willing to offer. If it's
yourself as the buyer's agent and the buyer, nothing to do with the seller.
Is it necessary for the buyer to attach with the offer to purchase proof of their commission agreement? Okay. No, the SPBB allows the seller to verify the compensation, but only after a binding purchase agreement has been executed, and then only if the seller requests. Okay. So here's the thing. I wouldn't divulge if they're not asking for it. Don't just give up all of your cards like poker, right? The whole purpose of poker, right? It's not to divulge, right? To play that, what we call poker face, right? So if the listing agent is not asking for a copy of your BRBC, don't include it. The only thing you're going to include, ladies and gentlemen, is your SPBB form. That's it. Right? Because that may alter the seller's decision to pay you less commission. Right? You're asking for this based on your BRBC, right? But if they're not asking for it, leave it alone. But now, if they ask it as part of the negotiations and you don't provide it as part of the counter, then the seller can says, well, we're not going to pay if they're not going to provide me with a copy of their BRBC. And they are entitled to. Okay, so you gotta understand the elements of that. Okay. Is it necessary for the seller to receive a copy of the commission agreement prior to the buyer being shown the home? Okay. So is it necessary for the seller to receive a copy of the buyer agreement prior to the buyer being shown the home? Okay. The answer is no. There is no such requirement under the NAR settlement. And doing so, many limit the pool of buyers that could make an offer on the property. Okay, so it's not a requirement, right? You're just seeing the property. There's no indicators that the buyer is going to submit an offer, right? So it's not part of the process. It's only and only when you submit an offer because your buyer wants this property and you're requesting compensation from the listing side or the seller. Yes.
Since we do calculations that the commission, the closing cost, how can you control on the appraisal?
Repeat the question and speak up a little louder.
Control before submitting or the appraisal price, because maybe the calculation will change. He won't be able to purchase if he's going to pay the difference of that house.
So the question is,
Appraisal comes down.
okay, so again, this is where you got to do your homework, right? No difference than when you go on a listing appointment, right? And the question here, folks, for people on Zoom is about the appraisal, right? What if the appraisal doesn't come into par based on, you know, the price, right? You got to do your work no difference than if you're doing a listing presentation, right? The whole purpose of a listing appointment is to make sure you're giving the seller comparables, right? Apples to apples, right? Okay. I understand you don't have to be an appraisal to do comparables. Okay. You can go on the MLS and look at all of the activity, active, under contract, pending, and sold in the last 90 days based on the characteristics of the property, meaning the square footage, how many bedrooms, how many baths, what's the lot size when the home was built, and what amenities, if any, and what upgrades the property has compared to other properties in the neighborhood, right? And you can get a sense and a base, an opinion of value, because it's an opinion. And the reason I say that is because you can get 3 appraisals to go and evaluate the home, and guess what? All 3 are going to be different. Okay? They may be close in proximity, but they're not going to be exactly, because it's an opinion of value based on their assessment. My assessment may be different than someone else's assessment. It's an opinion of value. So going back to your question, Jack, is what if there is an issue, right? Well, there's contingencies that protect the buyer and there's contingencies that protect the sellers, right? And part of it is the appraisal, but there's also a section on the purchase agreement that says that if the buyer is willing to come in with additional means, if the appraised value is less than what they offer, then the buyer will come in with the additional funds. If anything is less than the value of what you agree to, then the buyer and the seller have to make a decision, either to renegotiate the terms, right? Ask the seller if they're willing to come down, or ask the buyer if they're willing to come in with additional funds to close, or mutually cancel the agreement. The buyer, yeah, the buyer typically pays the appraisal, yeah, because the
in case you didn't like the opinion of the first one.
absolutely, yeah, yeah. So the buyer has options too. If the appraisal one is not up to par, you know, you can't. But I mean, here's the thing: if you get an appraisal out there and it's significantly less, it's questionable, right? And you as an agent have the right to, you know, hey, here are my comps that I provided. Did you consider this one that's similar in characteristics that's sold for this price, right? Because sometimes what happens, Jack, is there may be an outside appraiser that doesn't know, as an example, the bubble of South Bay. One street from another changes the trajectory of the value from one street to the other. And then there's areas, one street that is one city and the other is another city. That changes the value as well. And someone that is not familiar with an area may comp everything in corporate, and that could be a high value or a low comp. So to answer your question, yeah, a buyer may have the option to get another appraisal or a second opinion, or the lender may get another appraisal.
Something is really is increasing the price.
Well, and that's where you have to do your homework too, right? You know, if you're savvy and you know the market, right? Because you got to do your due diligence as a buyer, right? You got to do your homework and say, look, based on what I'm seeing, this property is where it needs to be. This is why you have, offers on it because it's priced where it needs to be, right? If it's too high, that's where you see property stay on the market for a very, very long time, right? It's either the condition of the property, maybe it's the area where the property is located, or maybe the property is just overpriced. Yeah, but it's always the price, right? It's always the price, right? All right, let's
Simon,
continue. We've got a couple more slides. Yes,
Simon. Also, when
yes.
we are doing for comparables, now we have to take in consideration whether the seller paid for commission or not.
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Well,
What's
the
that?
question is that, no, the question is that no, when we are doing comparables for our buyers, for instance, or sellers, now we wanted to take in consideration whether the seller, when they close a transaction, they pay a commission or not.
I don't think that's really relevant to that. I mean,
Well,
remember,
let's say that you have a house that was sold for $1 million and the seller paid 2.5%. And then you have another house in the same block and it's also 1 million or maybe 955, but he didn't pay a commission. You have to.
It's the sales price.
Yeah.
Reported sales price is ultimately what is,
yeah. So
what determines that.
correct, and I think Rosie, it's based on the sales price, right? And I get it, because part of the concession now, and again, it's no different than what is in the past, right? The concessions or the commission has always been part of the initial process, right? We would incorporate that as part of the seller's net proceeds, right? When we would do a net sheet, right? As an example, right? When we go on a listing appointment, we're going to try to sell the property for this. These are your costs. This is your balance of your mortgage. Here are the commissions, right? Here are the prorated taxes and all the escrow title fees and all these junk fees, right? This is what you'll net after the close of sale, right? And then we would have the seller sign agreeing that, this is an estimate, right? Well, that has not changed. Now what has changed is the seller has the option, right, to pay a buyer's agent commission, okay? When we're doing our estimated sheets or seller net sheet, you can do it where it's only the listing side, not even include the buyer's compensation because it's not part of the agreement now. That's a negotiating term. And now let's say that the seller is agreeing to pay a buyer's agent commission. Then we can redo the net sheet, right, to incorporate that additional means, right? And it's simple math, folks, okay? Because if you know it's $1 million at 3%, that's $30,000. That's going to be deducted from the seller's proceeds. If the seller is making 500,000 before paying 3%, then you're going to reduce that 30,000 from the seller's proceeds. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. I hope that kind of answers your question, Rosie.
No, I just wanted to say that we have to make a differentiation when you have closing sales and you have to look at, if that property, the seller offer a commission or this property and the seller did not offer a commission and take that in the equation.
Got it. And I believe that when the deal closes, there's language on there that says if there was concessions paid out. So full transparency, you're right on that. All right, let's continue. What constitutes sufficient verification of the commission owed in the buyer representation agreement? Can the seller demand to see the entire buyer representation agreement and all accommodating addendums such as the buyer's personal and financial information? The answer is no. The seller is only entitled to provide with a copy of the portion of the buyer representation agreement that identifies the compensation that the buyer has engaged to pay. For example, the last page of the form BRBC would suffice this. Okay. Bless you. If you look at the buyer representation agreement, right, there's a section, and you want to make sure that whatever percentage or flat fee that you put on there, I believe on the 4th page of the BRBC form, there also is the receipt. And that's the copy that, if requested, remember, we're not going to divulge that to the listing agent, but as part of the request encounters, right, they can say, you know, buyer agent to provide a copy of their BRBC. If that's a condition and you don't provide it, the seller may not be obligated to pay any compensation. Yeah. But if you do provide it, now the full transparency is, okay, we know what the buyer is paying their agent, and that's part of the process, all right? But it's only, you don't have to provide all of it. It's only the last page of the BRBC, okay? Right. If a seller signs a submitted offer, if a seller signs a submitted offer that has a SPBB attached but does not sign the SPB, is there a binding agreement?
No.
The answer is no. An addendum to the RPAs are not incorporated unless signed. A partial acceptance is effectively a counteroffer, but which the seller is rejecting one of the buyer's terms. It does not result in a binding agreement. To avoid misunderstanding, one of the following practice should be used. One, an addendum could be drawn up to clarify that the seller either has agreed or has not, or has no obligation to pay the buyer broker. The addendum would need to be signed by both parties. And the alternative approach would be for the seller to go back and sign the SPB form, which the buyer would then resign the end date. Okay, pretty clear. Should the listing agent have the seller fill out the SPB in advance of receiving an offer? The answer is no. In using the CAR form, the seller is not committed in advance to any cooperating commission or seller concessions. It is intended that the seller agreement, if any, to pay compensation to the buyer broker is fully negotiable term of the purchase agreement, right? So it's not like you can go in advance and say, hey, sign this to make sure, because if I don't get this signed, I'm not going to submit an offer. It doesn't work that way, all right? The way it works is you're submitting that as part of your request of negotiations. Just like, for example, if you know the property is listed for $1 million, right? But it's been on the market for 60 days. All right, you're going to question it. We may go with emotions of saying, let's throw an offer at 950, right? And see what happens. It's just submission, right? Doesn't mean the seller is going to accept it, but it's the same component and concept when it comes to your compensation. Okay, you're going to submit it with the request. The seller may come back and say no to it. The seller may counter it, or the seller may accept it. Okay, because just like the price, right? You may be surprised because it's been sitting for 60 days. The seller wants out because they already left the state of California and needs to delinquish this property because they're paying 2 mortgages. And that may be the pushing point for the seller to say, look, let's just do it. I want to get this property sold. Let's go ahead and, as part of your compensation on the SPB form, is that they'll accept it. All right. It's a negotiating tool. Okay. All right. That's it. This is it. All right. Any final questions in regards to the process? Okay. It's pretty clear, in my opinion, right? Remember, you need to have a buyer representation agreement. And once you identify a property, part of the process is you have that BRBC already executed, right? That's your employment, right? You're unemployed right now. You get employed by having that BRBC signed by the buyer. Now you're working for the buyer to find and identify and negotiate a property, right? Then when you find the property or your client finds the property that they want to make an offer, right? Part of the process is the submission of the offer. And the submission of the offer is your RPA, right? And all of the advisories, your possible representation, your wire fraud, your agency disclosure form, and all of the other forms, including your SPBB form, right? That's part of now the process, including your proof of funds, if asked, a pre-qualifying letter, if requested, as part of the package deal. It's, throwing the dice, hoping that the seller will accept or counter, right? And if they reject, then we need to find another property or submit a different price terms and condition. But remember, when submitting all offers moving forward, part of the initial process is if you want concessions to be paid by the listing side, the seller, then you must provide that SPB form. Okay. Any final thoughts, questions before we close out? All right. Well, I appreciate it, everyone. That concludes our class. I hope this presentation was of value. If you have any additional questions, by all means, please don't hesitate to reach out. Have a
Thank you.
wonderful weekend, and thanks again for being on the call. I'll see you in the next contract class.